Sure. Well, I'm Kenny Shu. I am the author of the book An Inconvenient Minority. And in fact, hold on a sec as I go get it real quick.
Okay.
But basically, if you want to know about all of my observations and work and insight on this case, definitely get this book for yourself. It's called An Inconvenient Minority, The Attack on Asian American Excellence and the Fight for Meritocracy. It extensively covers the Harvard teaching, and also like an echo here.
Oh, okay. Just a minute.
I think from Rui. Okay. Well, it extensively covers the Harvard case and also why we need to preserve meritocracy, which is, what is meritocracy, right? Meritocracy is the idea that we should treat people solely on the basis of their merits, of what they can contribute, rather than any aspect of their background. And it involves the idea of equal opportunity. First, we have to create an equal opportunity platform for people to be able to compete, for people to be able to compete. But if somebody is just genetically smarter or, more, better at sports or more creative or a better artist, and they win that competition, then it's fair. They should win. They deserve the rewards of what they get. Or if somebody is not as inherently smart, but works harder and studies hours and hours for the exam and gets a better score than the guy who's inherently more talented, but didn't study, then the guy who worked hard should be rewarded, right? And the reason why I support this idea is because we're all equal in the eyes of God, but we're not all equal in our skills, talents, and developments, right? Some of us are smarter. That's just the case. There is a thing called intelligence. And some of us are, just like some of us are better at sports, some of us are better at basketball. And if we built a society where we said, okay, well, the people who are super smart, we should make them half as smart, or we should punish them for being smart. And, the people who work really hard, we should punish them for working really hard. Then we're eliminating the ability for the most excellent people of our generation to innovate and to build become the next generation of great scientists, engineers, doctors, entertainers, the kinds of people who are going to move our society in a better direction. Right. And this is what this debate is about. This is what the Harvard admissions case is about regarding Asian Americans. So those of you who are not extensively familiar with the Harvard case, in Harvard University, the most prestigious university in the world, right? A lot of people want to get into Harvard. Okay. Not everybody can get into Harvard. I get it. So what's fair, right? Who should get in? It is a prestigious university with a $50 billion endowment that, you get access to some of the best professors in the entire world. Who do you want learning from the best professors in the entire world? Let me ask you guys a question. If you had a 5-year-old and you took this 5-year-old to the best professors in the entire world, is this 5-year-old going to get a lot of value from these professors? No, he's not, right? Because he just is not intellectually developed enough to learn from all of that these professors have to offer. So what you should be doing is that you should be admitting the best qualified people to learn from the best professors, the best teachers, and to have the ability to do the best research, right? You don't want to bring someone who is not very good at math to Harvard to do math. It's and that's meritocracy right here. It's the best use of society, and it's the best use of of a prestigious university like Harvard, when the best qualified people get in, regardless of who they are. Now, these Asians suing Harvard, right? Who are these Asian Americans? These are Asian Americans who have applied to Harvard and many of the other Ivy League schools in the country. Ivy League just means the top, universities, and they've gotten rejected. But meanwhile, they see their friends or their school colleagues who have lower SAT scores, which are like the standardized test scores that America use, and lower grades get into these schools, but these people happen to be of a different color, usually Black and Hispanic. Or, these are, kids that are mediocre intellectually, who are getting into Harvard, whose daddy donated a lot of money to Harvard, right? So Harvard is not admitting people meritocratically. But when we filed the lawsuit against Harvard, right, we did not yet have all of the data about the kinds of admissions policies that Harvard is practicing. We just hypothesized that Harvard had some sort of policy where they didn't want too many Asians. And the reason why they wouldn't want too many Asians is because if Harvard didn't discriminate against Asian Americans, Asians would make up about 43 to 50% of the university. Because Asian Americans tend to study really hard when they come to this country. They actually study twice as many hours as the average American. And if you look at a graph of the top people applying to Harvard, Asian Americans are applying to Harvard with, perfect SAT scores. About 35% of them have SAT scores that are nearly perfect. So Asian Americans are just either they're better innately intellectually, or they just work really hard. And doesn't matter, either of those are meritorious and fall into the framework of meritocracy, right? So this is what happens. We filed this lawsuit in 2014, and in 2017, we forced Harvard to send us their admissions data and make public their admissions data, which was then analyzed by the economist Peter Arcidiacono, who will be joining us very soon, I'm sure. He's just a couple of minutes late. But what Arcidiacono found, and what this data shows, is that Harvard practices a race-based admissions policy. If you look at the chances of getting into Harvard, an Asian American with a 25% chance of getting into Harvard has a 35% chance if he were white, a 75% chance if he identified as Latino, and a 95% chance if he identified as Black. So an Asian American with the same SAT scores and the grades is penalized by up to 70% just because he's Asian American. How does Harvard do this? They do this by evaluating people on 3 metrics. One is an academic score. Asian Americans score highest out of all the races on the academic score. 2 is the extracurricular score. Asian Americans score highest out of all the races on the extracurricular score. 3 is the personality score. And the personality score, for some reason, Asian Americans score lowest out of all of the races. What does the personality score measure? According to Harvard's own documents, they measure things like likability, humor, leadership skills, good fit for Harvard, right? And they decided that Asian Americans are the least likely to have these qualities. And it certainly doesn't come from the alumni interviews, because Asians score highest out of all the races on the alumni interviews. And it doesn't come from the teacher recommendations. They score highest, and they actually score second highest on the guidance counselor recommendations. So we have no idea where this comes from, where this idea that Asians are lesser personalities than comparable intellects of other races. We have no idea where this comes from. And so that's where the discrimination is baked in, right? Harvard's going to say, oh, Asians are not discriminated against, because if you look at all of this data, we Asians are predicted, this combined data, then Asians are predicted to have the same chance of getting in. But that's when you account for this personality score. And the personality score is what we are alleging is discriminatory. And in this case, basically, it progressed through the district court in 2019. The district court ruled against us. They ruled for Harvard. Now, the district court was kind of limited because of Grutter versus Bollinger, which is a U.S. Supreme Court case made in 2003 that said that schools could consider race in admissions for the purposes of diversity. And that has been the extent of Harvard's argument, that we are only using race as a factor because we want a diverse student body. So what they have done is they have defined Asians as non-diverse. And then they have, because they say we want diversity, they say, therefore, we can prioritize people of other races, the truly diverse races, and discriminate against Asians who are not diverse. That's their legitimization of this, and the court bought it. We of course appealed. The Court of Appeals bought Harvard. Finally, we appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court of the United States, the highest court of the land. They alone have the authority to reverse Grutter versus Bollinger, which is the aforementioned Supreme Court case where colleges are allowed to use race to discriminate for the sake of diversity. And right now, it is at the Supreme Court case. The Supreme Court took up our case in February of this year. We argued it last week in oral arguments, and we're expecting a decision in our favor from the Supreme Court, hopefully an overturning of Grutter versus Bollinger in May of next year. So that's my wrap up of basically how we got here.
Kenny, can I just jump in and ask a question about that? Because,
yeah,
I mean, you said that for the Asian American applicants, their personality rating is very high based on the alumni assessments, based on the teacher assessments, based on the guidance counselor assessments. So the individuals who actually know the person rated the person high. How can the admissions committee overrule that when they've never met the person?
Because the admissions committee gets to make the final decision on what the personality score is. The alumni interviewer can only make a recommendation. They cannot actually make a rating. What happens, what you see a lot in these Asian American applications is that Asian Americans are disproportionately likely to be scored by the admissions committee as SS. SS is an abbreviation for standard strong. Standard strong means typically strong applicant, not very distinguished. And of course, when you label somebody like that at Harvard, it's like it's almost like the death penalty for your admissions, because it means that they don't find you sufficiently distinguished, even if you've overcome disadvantage, even if you aced your math Olympiad, even if you got perfect SAT scores. And I get it, test scores don't define a person, but it says something about a person, right? You're willing to study super hard and, get through the SAT, which is, it's just a hard, test to study for. And you're willing to, get 4.0s in your GPA. That does say something about you. It says you have self-discipline. It says you're willing to defer gratification. It says that you have a longer view of the world. Those are positive personality traits. So I find this whole idea of a personality score rather absurd.
Well, I mean, it seems like your comments are well taken, of course, but it seems like the critical issue here is that the Asians aren't getting in because, given their academic qualifications, because their personality ratings are so low. And it just seems that the people who know the individual are rating them high, and the committee has never met the person. It just seems strange. How would they know what the person's personality is like if they've never met the person.
Yeah, again, this is where we're alleging discrimination because the committee has never met the person. The alumni interviewers have, and the teacher recommenders have, and they all greatly support the idea of a strong Asian personal rating. And then the committee that ultimately decides on it, who's never met this person, doesn't.
Well, since Arcidiacono isn't here, let me just say, as I recall in his statistical analysis, for the other groups, the ratings that they get on personality from the committee are very well predicted by the alumni, the teacher, and the guidance counselor ratings. So that they predicted very well in those cases. It's only with the Asians that the alumni, teacher, guidance counselor ratings are somehow not predictive, or they're, so it seems like they're being treated differently. And so yeah, I think it's consistent with the way you're describing it.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then another thing that's suspicious about the personality ratings is that controlling for your academic score. So controlling for your academic score that Harvard reviews, Blacks have the highest personality rating, followed by Hispanics, followed by whites, lastly Asians, significantly lower. So it's this very suspicious little personality hierarchy where that seems to just coincidentally match Harvard's preferred algorithm for the races in which they would prefer over others.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sakamoto and Mr. Kenny Zhu. Our second dialogue partner is Professor Ilana Redstone from University of Illinois. Ilana, do you have a few words?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to think where to begin. I mean, it's interesting. So I guess from my perspective, the way I think about this is less from, I mean, Kenny, sorry if we've never met, but I can call you Kenny. And so, is obviously super involved and has a lot invested, understandably, in the legal angle. Where I come in is in sort of my own work on these topics with students is more about how do we talk about it? And obviously there's overlap here, but sort of how do people talk and think about issues like using race in college admissions? And that's sort of where, so yes, there's almost a separation from this sort of the way the conversation about it unfolds and then what actually ends up happening as a Supreme Court decision and as a policy. And there's overlap between those two, but I guess so if I could just speak for a minute to the conversation piece and sort of the way it's talked about. I think part of what's hard is that the reasons we're not very good at sort of laying out collectively, like we haven't been very good at sort of laying out the concerns that come along with using race as a deciding factor in admissions decisions. And so we're left with a lot of people assuming that the only reason that somebody would take that position is because their race is driven by racism. And so I think that's a lot of kind of where things have broken down. Kenny, in his comments, in your comments, you sort of brought up this piece about diversity. And obviously you're right, like that Harvard has sort of made this argument that, that the reason that they can justify doing this is because of their interest in diversity, which then you have to argue has some kind of broader benefits. This is why there's that study, the one that everyone points to recently about the law school, the loose student reviews and how when they implemented more diverse editorial boards or whatever they're called, they had more citations and things like that, but trying to think through sort of what does it mean to have diversity as a benefit. And I don't think that we've done, so again, this is separate a little bit, what I'm saying is a little bit separate from the sort of policy and the Supreme Court decision side, but I don't think we've done a particularly good job of thinking through out loud and together what the implications of these things are. What does it mean to sort of take identity into as a factor in this way. How should we think about that? What are the, but how should we care about diversity? Does it matter? Why, who should decide? What is it? What are we using racial and ethnic diversity as a proxy for something else? Do we literally just care about race? Right? I don't necessarily have the answer to these questions, but we haven't done a very good job of asking them. And I think that it sort of breaks down how the whole conversation about, well, I mean, affirmative action generally, but race and college admissions more specifically, we sort of move through these conversations as though we have answers to questions that we've never bothered asking, and we've never bothered talking about how we sort of trade off, when the interests of different groups come into conflict, when different values come into conflict, how should we decide which one sort of is more important, why, who should decide, all of that stuff. And it all comes into play on the question of race and college admissions. And so I guess part of what always strikes me about this topic is just a real need to sort of step back and say, well, wait, what are we actually assuming are our values and our priorities? And can we at least be clear about that? Because part of what I feel like breaks down again is just a real lack of clarity about, and also a sort of imprecision in what we're even talking about. Like, what does it mean to, well, it helps this policy, diversity is good. Okay, well, what do you mean by good? Like, what does good mean? Well, how should we define good, and who defines it? What, using race and college admissions, it benefits certain groups. Okay, well, what do we mean by benefits, and how do we determine that? And what do we do if the benefit? What do you do if the same policy that benefits certain groups actually disadvantages other groups? How should you think about the competing interests of those groups? Right? Like, I don't. Again, thank God, no one's asking me to answer these questions, but these are all questions that are on the table on this topic and on related topics, if that makes any sense. So I guess that's what sort of always strikes me about it. Again, so I would just draw a little bit of a distinction between that and the sort of more practical, which is obviously super important side, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Professor Redstone. Let me just build on that. At Heterodox Academy, and specifically at Heterodox East Asia community, we really value like open, free debate, civil debate with people from different perspectives. And I had two questions. One is that Professor Redstone and Professor Sakamoto and also Kenny, in your university campuses, do you have this kind of open debate on affirmative action, or is this something that's so, I don't know what, maybe polarized or maybe something else that is difficult to have these open discussions? So I'm wondering, what was the experience in your campuses?
Yeah, if I can just jump in quick, so I talk about this all the time with students, all the time. Mm-hmm. But really from the place of not trying to convince them of anything in particular, but just trying to get them to think about it. So even just starting with the question, why might somebody oppose using race in college admissions? Oh, well, they might oppose it because they're racist. Okay, well, that's fine. Yeah, they have a sort of a deep resentment about the groups that stand to benefit from these policies. And that seems perfectly fine as something to put on the table to me. And then just even pushing the conversation further and saying, well, is there some other reason? Are there any other reasons why somebody might oppose this policy? Like, can you think of anything else other than sort of racism and racial animus? And usually that sort of moves the conversation forward. People can, I'm not trying to put in probabilities, like how likely do you think this is or whatever, just getting some other things on that list. And then now you're in a space where you can have a conversation about, well, if all you know about someone is that they are, just to use this example, opposed to the use of race in college admissions, how do you know that race is what's driving them, right? So it just opens. So I do have conversations, personally, I have conversations like that. It's a 15-week conversation.
I see.
Semester after semester. So yeah, I'll stop.
Sure. How about you, Art? What's your experience? Do you have these kind of open discussions on campus?
Well, I don't think we really do. Now, Texas A&M, the undergraduate admissions, doesn't, to my knowledge, have much affirmative action policy at all. But we do at the graduate level. So that's where you see some of this discussion at the graduate level, but that's handled by each department separately. So I can only speak to sociology, which is my department. And, there's a very strong in favor of affirmative action in sociology, quite a bit.
Okay, and if you disagree, do you have the freedom to maybe like disagree with the affirmative action policy in your department, or is it kind of understood that nobody should disagree?
I would say it's closer to the latter. Yeah, there's a very strong favoritism for and to disagree with affirmative action is really taboo in sociology.
Just to be clear, I'm talking about undergraduates. I'm not talking about engagement with the administration or the institution or even the graduate program. I'm talking specifically about undergraduates.
Yeah,
Okay.
undergraduate and graduate's different. In undergrad, we don't have this because the university handles that. And my institution, I don't think does a lot of affirmative action.
Sure. Also, the same question to Kenny, like, in your experience, have you had opportunities for kind of open debate on this, or are people not willing to debate you?
Yeah, so I mean, I've asked some of the leading defenders of affirmative action to debate with me. I will actually have a debate pretty soon at UNC Chapel Hill, who are also suing for this policy pretty soon. Hopefully that's going to happen, but I do find that a lot of the affirmative action supporters, well, it's not, they just they would rather not they would rather not talk about this. They would rather put it under the rug, or they would kind of just poo-poo it and say, oh, this is not really an issue, it's just over a few spots. But it's not just over a few spots, this is over an entire ideology.
Well,
I mean, this is over an entire ideology that says, well, actually, your race is important and we should make it more important in your life. That's what it's about. I don't like to talk from experiences when I don't back them up with facts. But I'll just say from my experience, the first time I brought up the idea of writing my book, An Inconvenient Minority, to my political science professor, this was when I was a senior in college. The first thing she said was very snarkily, well, good luck getting sympathy for rejected college applicants. That's what she said. I remember that. So, yeah, looks like this case is a national issue now. I'm glad it is. It's starting this conversation. Glad I could write my book. Glad it became a bestseller. Clearly, she's wrong about that.
Okay, thank you, Kenny Sue. I see Peter, Professor Peter Arcidiacono. I don't know if I pronounced that right. Welcome. Would you like to have the floor?
Sorry for being late here. Very sorry. Do you want me to answer that specific question about the debate side?
Sure, you can. Yeah, you can start with that or anything else you want to start with.
So, I think that at a place like Duke, it is a taboo topic to discuss publicly. We've got a great class taught by a buddy of mine, which tries to promote having honest disagreement about these things. And, what he specifies in the class on polarization, and what they outline up front is assuming good intent as a starting point, and to argue according to actually have arguments rather taking down the individual. And I think that's I think right when I jumped in, I was hearing someone talk about this with regard to somebody could be against affirmative action because they were racist. And as soon as you go there, that automatically kills the conversation. So trying to evaluate the argument and assuming that the argument's made not from not from trying to be duplicitous about these things. And that's a hard thing because, you know, a lot of my work has been done on this issue of mismatch. And I think automatically people assume that it must mean I'm out to get minority students. And what I'm actually interested in is being honest about how programs work. And how can you be honest, but without still showing compassion for the situation? So, you know, I got to actually attend the Supreme Court hearings on these cases. And one of the very striking things was what Justice Jackson said. And she said, you know, race is just one of 40 factors. You know, basically, what's the big deal? And the implication of that is that racial preferences are small, and that when you get to college, you're not going to see any differences based on race. And I just know that not to be true because I actually have the data on this. And when I say I have the data on this, it's not to try to label one group as, you know, doing worse than other group. It's not a genetic argument or anything of the sort. It's when you get to college, because of what's happened before college, due to inequities in education before then, it produces, you know, we think that stuff has to matter. So you look at the number of Black students who have taken calculus before they go to college, it's going to be a lot smaller than the number of white and Asian students who have taken calculus. That's going to matter. And so I know that you come in, and if you're 1.5 standard deviations below your peers on SAT math scores, that's going to affect what majors you choose. I think a really good example of it, and so then you go to college and you're behind, but you've been told that the preference was small. Then you perform poorly. Now, how do you process that? You could think, oh, I wasn't actually as prepared as I thought, or you could say, this place is racist. And that, I think, really creates a problem. I think a really good example of this was what happened to a Georgetown law professor. And she got caught on Zoom lamenting the fact that her Black students were disproportionately falling at the bottom of the grade distribution. She actually tried to quit after that because it caused such an uproar. And Georgetown wouldn't let her quit, is my understanding. They said, we have to fire you, okay, for being racist. And everyone assumed that this was a really racist statement. Well, I have the data. I've written survey articles on this. You know, the 50th percentile of Black admits to a place like University of Michigan in terms of your undergrad grades and your LSAT scores, falls at the 2nd percentile of white admits. Now, if LSAT and grades don't matter for law school performance, then we have the screening device that is useless and we shouldn't be using it at all. But it turns out those LSAT and grades are highly predictive of what your class rank is going to be in law school. And so it is the case that they disproportionately fall at you know, the bottom 10% of the class because of affirmative action. But instead of sealing that is a feature, not a bug. I mean, it's designed to do that, to bring in the people who have lower credentials by definition. And so, but then the conclusion of the law school students is Georgetown is racist in their grading practices, when it was actually the preferences themselves that resulted in the differential performance. That's just being honest about what the data show. It's not trying to, you know, hold any group back. It's saying we need to be clear as to exactly what's going on so we can fix the underlying problems. As opposed to this, you know, front. Sorry, I probably talked way too long, but.
No, that's good. I just wonder, what do you mean by mismatch? Some people may not know.
So mismatch, the idea is that you can have preferences get to a point where it actually hurts the outcomes of the student. So the way I would describe it, everybody actually believes in mismatch, just depends on how you calculate. So there's a reason we don't have sixth graders take calculus, right? Because they're not ready for calculus. In a similar manner, I went to Willamette University. It's a small school in Salem, Oregon, and there was no calculus in the econ major. Now I'm teaching at Duke, and I do, Calc 3, the multivariable calculus is a staple for the intermediate micro class. And what I tell the students in that class is, if you haven't already had Calc 3, you're going to work harder and get a lower grade. The more you come in behind, the harder it's going to be to do that. So somebody could come in and they would have been fine being an econ major where I went to college, but at Duke, that's not going to work out so well. And it's particularly a problem for courses in the sciences and math, because those courses are sequential in nature. You need to do the one before you do the other. And that's really, so when we think about mismatch and the idea about, can I make it at the school? What part of that depends on what major we're talking about, how much of that major builds on the previous stuff. So, the conservative argument against affirmative action is often twofold. One is a fairness issue. Should you be making admissions decisions based on your race alone? Well, not on your race alone, but having race play a role in that. And then the other is the mismatch issue, that you can have preferences go so far that it actually means worse educational outcomes, at least on some dimensions, from something like that. What's very interesting in the University of North Carolina case is that actually splits the conservative argument in two. Why do I say that? UNC has in-state admissions and out-of-state admissions. And if you apply to get into UNC out-of-state, it's much more competitive, because UNC says we can only have 18% of our enrollees come from out-of-state. What that means is admit rates in like the low teens for out-of-state applicants, but it's in like near 50% for in-state applicants. What happens, the largest preferences are actually for UNC out-of-state applicants. So my estimates would say 9 out of 10, over 9 out of 10 Black out-of-state admits would not have been admitted absent racial preferences. The numbers for in-state are not near as drastic as that.
Peter, I just have one more question, and then we'll move on, I guess. But before you came, Kenny and us, we were talking about the personality rankings that Harvard gives to Asian students as being possibly biased or downwardly biased. I mean, do you know about that? Can you speak to this issue about Harvard and its personality rankings for Asians versus other groups?
Oh, definitely. So, basically I did the statistical analysis to show that. I think it's blatantly, it's very clear. So I estimated models of the personal rating. So what that means is, the Harvard admissions officer gives you a personal rating on the scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is better. And you can see that Asian Americans have the lowest personal ratings on average at Harvard. And Harvard also, I find that they discriminate against Asian Americans there. So how do you know that it's discrimination versus something else? Well, I'm going to point to a few facts. The first is that on all the other ratings, Asian Americans are not the lowest. Well, the athletic rating is a separate story. But the way this thing works is they have characteristics that are actually associated with higher personal ratings, yet they get lower personal ratings. And whatever model you estimate of the personal rating, you always see this big negative coefficient negative penalty against Asian American applicants with no explanation for, why this happens. So for the non-statistics people in the world, so for me, that's the most convincing, it's a statistical modeling. But I'm going to point to two other pieces of evidence that I think confirms it. The first is at UNC, we actually don't see discrimination against Asian Americans. And they also have a personal rating. But Asian Americans do just fine on that personal rating. So it really shows they're doing it in a way to sort of racially balance. And the second thing is that I read the files as part of my work in the case. So I read, over 400 files. In the case that really haunts me, and the reason I actually try to approach these things dispassionately because I'm trying to be academic research on this. And it's important that, you try to approach it as dispassionately as possible. But there's a case that haunts me to this day, which was an Asian American female applicant. This is the only case that I can talk about because I actually wrote lots of material about my reading of the files, and it got all redacted from the public reports. But the one file I can tell you about, I actually testified on the stand, so it's in the public record. And this was an Asian American female applicant who spent time in foster care, whose father suffered from a severe mental illness, and her and her mom got hit by a drunk driver the summer before her senior year. And she writes about all these things in her essays. And the teachers' letters, comment on everything that she's overcome. And the alum who interviews her, so at Harvard, you can interview with alumni, and that will be part of your record. So the person who interviews her says, it's incredible what this person's overcome. One of the most impressive interviews I've ever had. And the alums actually rate you on the personal score too. And the alum gave her a very high score. And that's the thing about these, what the admissions officer gives you for your personal rating, they don't make you. Very few, something like between 2 and 3% get interviews with admissions officers at Harvard. Most do not. So this particular applicant got the normal personal score rating that basically everybody gets. And the only comment that the admissions officer wrote on her file was SS. And what SS means is standard strong. And what that means is good, but not good enough. Everybody who gets that gets rejected. And actually in my reports, I can tell you this too. The people who get labeled standard strong, Asian Americans way disproportionately. That's in my reports too. Good, but not good enough. It's infuriating to read that comment about that file, because you could say, look, this story's too unbelievable, all the stuff that she's gone through. But to say standard strong is absurd. Now, the other funny story about that file was she was actually also a champion figure skater, but did not get a fantastic rating on the athletic rating. Why not? Well, because the athletic rating is designed to for people who might walk on to Harvard sports. So keep in mind, I should have brought this up earlier. Harvard rates you, gives all applicants an athletic rating. That would seem sort of weird, right? That they would have that be something as a criteria for admission. But the people who do best on that athletic rating are white legacy students. And the reason for that is because it rewards people who participate in sports that Harvard offers. We often think about sports as an equalizer. At Harvard, that's not the case. At Harvard offers more varsity sports than any school in the country. And the last sport you end up offering is a sport like sailing. So I went into the case thinking legacy admissions were much more problematic than the bumps you get for athletics. I don't feel that way for Harvard because the bumps for athletics are so much higher, and it's for sports like sailing. If you got rid of sports preferences, the number of whites would go down, the number of African Americans would stay the same, and the number of Asian Americans and Hispanics would go up. I think if you can even target it more, just keep like football and basketball and just get rid of the sports like squash and sailing and fencing and such. And then you'd see blacks go up as well. Yeah.
You know, Ilana was talking about what is diversity. Do you want to make any more comments about that in regard to these particular cases, athletic and personality, in this particular case with this individual overcoming severe disadvantages?
Yeah, I mean,
Oh, sorry, did you go ahead? Did you mean for Peter or for me?
I was going to see if you wanted to jump in, Ilana.
Me, Ilana.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I guess two things quickly. One, just to correct the record. One, so just Arthur, when we were saying before about, and I said I was talking about undergraduates, I was not talking about undergraduate admissions at the University of Illinois. I'm talking about my conversations with undergraduates that I talk with them about this. I am not involved in the undergraduate. I just want to, because we're recording this, I just want to be super clear that what I was talking about was like my engagement with undergraduates in the classroom and sort of that we talk about this all the time. So that was one clarification. The other clarification before sort of thinking about diversity is, Peter, sort of when you came on the call, I was the one that was talking about what I'm saying is the conversations that I'm having with students are not saying that anyone who opposes using race in college admissions is racist. I'm saying, like, if anything, it's the other way around. But I also don't think it would be right, not that you were necessarily saying this, but I also don't think it would be right to say that nobody who opposes using race in college admissions is sort of what we would think of as conventionally racist either, right? Like, so it's, if all you know about someone is that they're what the sort of the traditional version of racism, you're making a reasonably good prediction that they're opposed to the use of race in college admissions, but it doesn't go the other way, right? Like if all you know is that they have this position, like it wouldn't be right to infer that they are then motivated by racism. That's the conversation that I'm having with students, and the importance of understanding that we don't know. And that how do you want to move through the world sort of with people who have different opinions, if given that you don't know that. I just wanted to clarify that. With respect to diversity, Arthur, and what you're saying, I mean, I think it's, yeah, I mean, I just feel like we don't have a conversation about this, not just on this session, but sort of, yeah, what are the points of diversity that we care about? If we care about racial and ethnic diversity for its own sake, and maybe we do, maybe there are reasons that we should, then be super clear about why. What is it proxying for? Is it proxying for some diversity of background? Is it actually proxying for socioeconomic diversity? Is it proxying for thought diversity? It's not necessarily a particularly good proxy for that, but what is it? And sort of being clear. There are a lot of different arguments that you could make, but we're very sort of sloppy with how we talk about it, which I think leads people to use words in different ways, to think about these terms and these values in different ways, again, because we're just not clear about it. So I'll stop there, but thank you for letting me correct the record.
Sure. We need to open it up for a Q&A. So let's have a few more comments and questions from the audience so they can participate. And
I
again,
have one question for the audience before the audience asks me questions, because I know there are high schoolers who are here. High schoolers, have you felt like comfortable, or have you ever heard any of these facts about affirmative action and the preferences for students of specific races?
Well, yes.
Okay.
There is.
Wait. before we ask the high schoolers, of Peter, you came late, but we're recording this session. But after this forum is over, if you happen to say anything that you don't want to share on a public setting, please email me, and then email me if you feel uncomfortable, and then we may, in that way, if you do not want to, if you do not want this in the public sphere. Okay, so I want everybody to feel comfortable, say what you want, and then at the end, if you said something that you don't want to, that you don't want to go out, just let us know. Okay, and so we will, we will try to, because we do want to protect everybody's. It's a very sensitive topic. We do want to protect you. Okay, now, high school students, you're up first. James, did you want to ask a question?
I was answering.
Yeah. So
Okay,
what
go
was
ahead.
going on?
Yeah, so we do hear about affirmative action, but not much of the details. So for example, I had the impression that they wanted affirmative action to benefit the racists for like past transactions or something. I didn't think it was about diversity, so we just hear about it, but not know much about it. At least for me.
Okay, thank you, James. And also James and everybody else, if you're able, please turn on your video so we can have a more like interactive dialogue. Okay, thank you, James. Okay, yes, you look very comfortable. Do we have any other high school students who wants to ask a question? I got a text from Gina. Gina, are you ready with your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is a question for Kenny.
Yeah.
Earlier you mentioned like the implementation of a meritocracy and rewarding those who study and work hard. But how do you think this applies to like lower income communities that may not have access to such opportunities or resources?
Okay. So, let me ask you, is Harvard, actually, I don't want to sound sardonic, so I'm just going to make my point. Harvard is not the only college out there. There are many colleges out there, and they cater to a wide variety of students. There are colleges that have no admissions criteria whatsoever. Anybody can get in. So if you're not going to Harvard, it's not the end of the world. And what we should be doing in a meritocracy, Gina, is the people who are academically at the same people at this the people who are academically at the same level should be going to colleges in which that cater to people of that academic level, right? You shouldn't be it's like, why would you take algebra 2 when you don't even know algebra 1, right? And let's say, let's say by some fluke, you should have gotten into one of the top colleges based on your qualifications, but you didn't. We have a transfer system in this country. You can always transfer. You can always take 2 years at this current college and then go to another college that better fits where you are. So I really believe in this system, and what college counselors should be doing and should be saying to high school students is they should be saying, they should be talking about the opportunities to work within the college system. But what they shouldn't be saying is they shouldn't be saying, well, you are of a low socioeconomic background, so that means that we need to that colleges should preferentially admit you, right? If you are of a low socioeconomic background, you have issues that colleges should be taking care of. And Harvard is an elite institution meant to cater to the elite of the elite. It's not a good fit. Most likely it's not going to be a good fit for you academically and everything like that. You need to go to a place that's going to cater to your needs and where you are. Now, if you're of a low socioeconomic background and you have the requisite merit to get into Harvard, then you should be judged on the basis of that merit. But if you're not, then you should then there are other places and colleges that are supposed to be catering to their needs. And if they're not, then that's a real policy higher education issue that we need to fix.
Okay, thank you, Gina and Kenny. Okay, let's move it up to the whole entire audience. If you have a question or comment, please, yeah, this is your chance. Who wants to ask, share a question or comment? Oh, okay, can you come up? Oh, you can.
Where do I look?
Yeah, right there.
Right there. Hi, my name is Jeffrey Engel. I'm a is it good? My name is Jeffrey Engel, and I'm a student from Oregon State University, studying in Seoul for just a semester. I guess this question isn't directed towards anyone specifically, just to as an answer, but if the conversation surrounding affirmative action, specifically for Harvard, is that the students who are admitted maybe aren't the most qualified to be there, is there any data statistically that shows the success of these students by racial demographics at Harvard? I know the professor from Duke spoke on success rates for different racial demographics at other universities, but specifically at Harvard, are we seeing any disproportionate levels of success between different races?
So the truth is, I don't know for Harvard because we weren't given the outcome data. Though I can say that on something like graduation, you're not going to see that matter. Harvard will find a way to graduate you. My experience at other universities like Duke is that it's going to be more along the lines of choice of major and things of that nature. I also wanted to respond a little bit to what Kenny said earlier in terms of how the preferences operate for low-income students. You know, I think we often think about SAT scores as being, and great, you know, the academic stuff as being not favoring those from poorer backgrounds, but it's actually the other stuff that Harvard uses that is more that way. So like I mentioned with the athletic rating, with the personal rating, legacies do especially well on that. And the story I would tell is, you know, my son, when he got to work for a Duke computer science professor one summer. Why does he get to do that? Because I have connections and because he doesn't have to earn money. So it's actually a lot of these systems, like in other countries, I think when you mentioned that you're in Korea, they have something that's based totally on tests in Korea. And then they have a few slots that are not based on those, that are more holistic. And those more holistic spots, my understanding is, favor the rich. It's the test-based ones that actually go the other direction. But, you know, to the original question, I don't know what the answer is at Harvard in particular. And I think that the reason we don't know is actually a fundamental problem in higher education, which is universities hide their data. And we should instead, as universities, be using the data to help the students. Every university signs confidentiality agreements to do research on other people, but ironically doesn't want you looking at their own data. And that's a real shame, because I think we could improve educational outcomes a lot by doing that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey. All right. Okay, anybody else? Just raise your hand. Oh, okay. Yes, I see Daniel, Mr. Daniel Barbash. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Daniel Barbash. I work at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. So I have a question for anyone on the panel who wants to answer, which is about the use of diversity in all these arguments, because I read a very interesting book by Peter Wood a number of years ago where he talked about diversity, the invention of a concept. That was the title. And it was, where did this whole idea of diversity come from? And my understanding is that it was a kind of throwaway line by one of the justices in one of the early Supreme Court cases, where he, as a single person, evoked diversity in a few sentences as a justification for affirmative action. And that it spread like wildfire after that because most people were equating affirmative action with race-based quotas, which is kind of fundamentally what it is, and everyone's against that. And so this idea of diversity started as a throwaway line, but everyone grabbed onto it because it was a totally different way to try to justify affirmative action, which you could also talk about as race-based quotas. So I find because of that, it's very hard to talk about diversity because it's kind of a smokescreen and in some ways a dishonest presentation, even though I think there are legitimate things you can put under that conception. But I find it very challenging to bring that into this discussion of affirmative action. So I'd be interested how anyone involved in the case addresses that.
Well, I definitely take the point. I think that that started a whole academic literature, that line from the Supreme Court's decision. And it really changed, like, I think it is a front for trying to redress historical wrongs, that the Supreme Court says you can't use it for that purpose. But it's created really strange incentives. So there's one paper that showed over 40% of Black students at Ivy League schools were first or second generation immigrants. Now, as you go to less selective schools, that's not true. So, but when you think about that, it really isn't about diversity or reparations. So if it's about reparations, then the targeting doesn't work very well in that regard. And then, the thing that I find a little nauseating is when we talk about we value all sorts of diversity, but then we only keep track of one form of diversity. Harvard will talk about things like we value religious diversity. Well, I think what one potential outcome of the Supreme Court case is to get Harvard to treat race the way they treat religion, which is religion is something you fill out on the Common App. And Harvard chooses not to download that information. Now, why don't they download that information? Well, they had a history of discriminating against the Jews. But they will tell you that they do value religious diversity, and that can still show up through things like the statement of purpose and all of that. But really, the primary thing they're keeping track of is race.
Yeah, I want to address this as well. I guess just a rhetorical question, but maybe if one of you want to answer it, please do. How much pressure right now do you guys feel to have friends of different races? Some are saying zero, some are saying a lot. I, for one, feel like there's a lot of pressure on me to have like a token minority friend or like a friend of a different race, I feel like if I don't have friends of a different race, like I might get called like racially biased or racist or something like that, it's weird. We live in such a weird climate right now. It's like, I don't know if you guys chose your friends because of their race, but I didn't. I just chose my friends because like they were around me, and it just so happened that the people who were around me, a lot of them were Asians, right? And I have some white friends and I have some Black friends, and it turned out to be pretty diverse, but I didn't feel any pressure until very recently that I like really needed a diverse friend, and I think that that's kind of like what's motivating this Harvard diversity ideology. I think it's Harvard, the university that has been occupied by white people, like literally since John Harvard sailed the Mayflower. They suddenly feel this pressure to like, oh man, I need to have the diverse friends. Like I need to have that friend, I think that's what it is. There's like there's some kind of guilt about it. And I don't feel that guilt, and it's fine if you want to go and say, well, I want to go and meet people of different backgrounds and everything like that. But you can't compromise admitting the most qualified student for that. Like you can't just you can't just go and stretch out a limb and say, we're just going to pick somebody up who is significantly less qualified on the objective metrics just so we could have a diverse friend. You know, that's unacceptable. So I think that, you know, the pressure these days to feel like you are a inclusive person is one of the reasons why Harvard is doing this. But I don't think it should come at the cost of admitting the most qualified candidate.
Okay, thank you, Kenny and Daniel. Is there any other questions or comments from anybody in the audience? I
Can I just add
encourage
one
everybody
thing
to
to
speak
that?
out. Oh, yes, go ahead, Peter.
So, you know, I actually really do believe in the concept of diversity. I just think I feel like I've benefited a lot from diversity, but in a different way. So, you know, my views tilt a little more conservative than the typical academic. And I find that has three benefits. One, most people aren't working on the questions that I'm going to work on because, you know, we're more in this echo chamber. So I've got lots of opportunities to do that. Two, I really do learn from the fact that my views are different from those. And so I feel like I've gained a lot of intellectual humility, which I think is a really good thing. And then, of course, the third benefit is that they'll never make me chair from having the different points, which I also really appreciate.
Okay, I see another hand from a high school student. James, you had a question?
Yeah, I heard earlier, I don't remember who it was, but I heard that the interviews for Harvard.
Can you say that louder?
I heard someone, I'm not sure who it was.
James, we cannot hear you.
How
Say
about
it one
now?
more time. Yeah.
I heard that the interviews for Harvard are rare. Can you tell me how rare they are?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question.
So
Peter, maybe
they're
you
very
can-
rare for, there are two kinds of interviews. The first interview is with the alumni, and those are not rare at all. And that forms the alumni personal rating. So the alumni is going to give you your own personal rating, and we account for that in our modeling. Now, what you would have, my expectation was that would be where you would find discrimination, because these are alumni, you know, they haven't had diversity training. And, you know, they're primarily going to be, you know, rich white guys. But we don't see that near to the extent that we see it among the admissions officers. And that's where you hardly ever get an interview with an admissions officer. And the people who do are often going to be recruited athletes and such.
Okay, thank you, Peter and James. Okay, was there anybody else? Yes, Chansor, go ahead. Yeah, you can come up and introduce yourself. Mention Korea. From Seoul, Korea.
Hi, my name is Chen Sol from Korea here at Hanyang University. I have a question to Mr. Zhu. So in the beginning, you said about meritocracy, then that we should give equal opportunities to everyone. But I just personally think that that's not really possible. So this may be a little off topic, but aside, but talking about race, I think most students who go to top universities are also from rich families. So here also in Korea, the best school here is Seoul National Universities and about and Hanyang. Yeah, and Hanyang. So yeah, I would say like about top 7 universities in Korea, including Hanyang and like Seoul National Universities. About 40% or over students are from rich families. And this is also kind of like discussed in the book, The Tyranny of Merit by Michael Sandel. And it's like students from rich families, they get more opportunities because their parents kind of buys that opportunity. So they get better private tutors, they get more opportunities to be involved in big programs. And that's what helps them to get into good universities. So And I think this also applies to many colleges, not only in Korea, but also in USA. I also heard that a lot of students in Ivy Leagues are also from really rich families. So if we consider that wealth is also an important part, sending students to top universities, how is it possible to give equal opportunities to everyone?
It's not possible to give completely equal opportunity to everybody. Unless you strip the wealth of the top 50% of people and give them to the bottom 50% of people in exactly the same order. That's how you would give completely equal opportunity. So
Okay.
I'm not sure how that would go. I know it's been tried. Didn't turn out so well, but it's been tried. Here's what I would say. There are some things that society can do for you, and there's some things that society just can't do for you. And there's some things that you're just going to have to live with. These are things I have to live with. One thing I have to live with is the color of my skin. I can't change the fact that I'm Asian. This is why race-based discrimination I find so invidious, because I literally cannot change the fact that I was born this way. Another thing is you can't change the family you're born into. So, but one thing, and this is more of like a point about education. Just because you're rich doesn't mean just because you're not rich doesn't mean that you can't get education to the level of a rich person. I'll give you an example of the Chinese kids studying for the SAT. Chinese kids in New York City are some of the poorest kids in the entire United States, Chinese kids, yet they have the highest SAT scores in the entire city. And they're poor, like their parents are dirt poor. They're running like restaurants, hairdressers, those kinds of things. For all purposes, they're getting a rich person's outcome despite the fact that they are poor. And what this shows to me is that education is not something that is entirely dependent on wealth. Yes, wealth can affect it, but you can definitely study. And there's so many textbooks out there that if you put your nose to the grindstone, you study, you can get the outcome that you want in education. Education is one of those things where hard work really, really does matter. So if you want to be educated, you can be educated. It's going to take some work, but you have to do it. And if you want the opportunities that are afforded to your family later on because of that education, then you know what to do. Pick up a book tomorrow, start training yourself in STEM. Do pre-algebra, do some algebra, learn calculus, maybe learn some coding if you're into that. You don't have to be. Learn a skill that people are going to value, and then you're going to be on your way to being a well-compensated person in life.
Okay, thank you, Kenny. I got a message from one of the audience members. Let me repeat what she said. I'm a 7th generation American, descendant of U.S. slaves. This conversation does a disservice to educating these students by its absence of history about affirmative action. I host this space about affirmative action. The students should listen to it. And so I'm gonna go ahead and share this with everybody. Okay, great, thank you. Thank you for sharing your comment. Is there anybody else? Okay,
Wait, if I could
yes.
respond to that comment real quick. What are you specifically referring to?
Do you want to speak on this, or do you just want to message me?
So, I think I have an idea about that, and I do take the point that racial inequities in this country, in part due to the legacy of slavery, are things that need to be dealt with. For me, the issue is this a good way of dealing with it? And to me, I think that fundamentally, we have issues that are starting earlier, and to the extent that we want to do things about them, I think we need to do the things that have been shown to be very effective are things like no excuse charter schools. And providing the educational choice so that you have access to those things, I think is incredibly important. It's not, in my mind, it's not a question of, I do think it's a problem, if you got rid of affirmative action and we had at Harvard only 1% were Black. That would say that we as a society have done something earlier that needs to be addressed. And I think we can do things to address them in ways that are more successful, and also don't lead to things that I think are really not okay, such as what we see at Harvard, in particular with discriminating against Asian Americans relative to white students for that purpose as one extreme. But I think it goes beyond that to, should our focus be more on income versus race?
Okay, Denise had a question or comment. Go ahead, Denise, you have the floor. Denise, we cannot hear you. Turn your audio on.
Hi, are you able to hear me?
Okay, yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. Sorry, I'm in transition, which is why I couldn't speak earlier, so pardon the delay. And thanks for the opportunity to speak. I've actually enjoyed the conversation. It's been very enlightening. So I think part of the issue here is that we are talking about race in regard to the history of the impetus for affirmative action, when what we're really talking about is lineage. Not every Black person in the world experienced what my grandparents, my mother, who was born into segregated Jim Crow Mississippi, my oldest sibling was born before civil rights legislation was passed. Not every Black student everywhere or Black person experienced that. We're talking about lineage, which is the particular families who did endure the issues, the problems, the deprivation, the terror that caused the impetus for John F. Kennedy, right, to see what was going on in our nation and said we needed to act with deliberate speed and take affirmative action to enfold American Negroes into the economic and educational fabric of the United States. It is not a racial issue. So if you are a Caribbean American, a Nigerian American, a Kenyan American, or whatever, even though you may be Black, affirmative actions were not about you. It was about the people who endured the stuff of building the human rights legacy of the nation. And what I'd like to see our court system do with this case, much like Ketanji Brown Jackson and also Kavanaugh in some of his questions, what I want to see them do is acknowledge the reality that we need to get back to the root of what's inspired AA, and that is rapidly unfolding American Negroes into the economic and educational fabric of America. And to the extent that institutions and the people in them have an anti-Black American bias, making sure that that bias is not there. So I don't buy the diversity piece. I have my own components and criticism about that. I won't take up time in this space with that component of it, but it's about lineage, not race.
Yeah. No,
Kenny, we only have 7 minutes left. Thank you, Denise. If Denise or anybody has like a website you want to share, please email or please email it to me and I'll share with the whole audience. We only have 7 minutes left, so let me get a quick question from Francis, and then I had a question too.
I want to do it. Hold on, I want to do it.
Oh,
Talk about
okay.
that because I think it's very fair what she said. I mean, you don't often get this kind of discourse. I've been like looking for this kind of discourse, honestly. Yeah, you're right. I mean, of course, your history matters. You know, the history of American slaves and the history of how Native Americans were treated and the history of how many Asian Americans were treated in this country matters so much. You know, it's part of your story. You have a right to tell that story. I think people should tell that story. You know, Asian Americans haven't necessarily been, you know, treated the best by this nation either, or by the nations that they immigrated from. I think all of us, Denise, are looking for America to be a land of opportunity, right? We're not looking for handouts. We're not looking for people to give us stuff. And we're not looking for completely equal outcomes because that's impossible. And it's also bad. We are looking for a country where we can compete equally and be free and live, have our lives to live the way that we want to live, and to, and to be able to judge each other ultimately on the content of your character, not the color of your skin. And affirmative action in the form of racial preferences at college admissions does nothing to do either of those things. One, it makes race more salient in public life. It makes you and I, we have to have a racial dichotomy now, even though I just want to have a conversation with you. And it's not giving equal opportunity. It's actually discriminating against another minority group to give one minority group stuff. So I don't believe in giving minorities stuff at the expense of other minorities. That's just not the way this country should work. We should be treating people on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. That's what I believe will do justice to the legacy and how America has failed in doing that for so long. But that's what we need to aspire towards. Anyway,
I think that's great but the reality is that our families have 400 years of history that is an accumulated burden that other people who haven't experienced that can talk about in theory, but we're living it in practice. There's a lot more that can be said, and particularly the ways in which people don't seem to understand the ways that living through that and enduring that. The fact that my stepfather growing up in Money, Mississippi, has seen Black men and children strapped to the center of town through lynching and the like, the trauma that causes him, the mental health problems that causes them, the ways in which living in this society that treats you as the bottom caste in the country that you built actually affects your functional performance, including academic performance and well-being. Those things aren't accounted for by people who come to our nation and want more of what we have to offer and are willing to seek that more at our expense of what we have earned. So I think there's an opportunity for ongoing dialogue here. And there's an element of trauma-informed care and trauma-informed practices that I think we really need to be infusing into this conversation in order to understand it fully.
Yeah, I just don't think race preference is the way to inform, to treat all of the maladies that you just expressed to me. I don't think that race preferences does any justice to what you're saying. What you're saying is you want to tell your story, and you want people to listen and acknowledge that. But how does
I want economic and educational transformation, and education is one of those ways to do it.
Right. Great. I think I think most of us have to leave in about 3 minutes. So there's just 2 more questions left, and then you guys can stay as long as you want. Francis, go ahead, share your question or comment.
Hi. Thanks for the discussion so far. I think this is sort of going back to something Gina asked very early on. And I guess this is a question to Kenny. Given that affirmative action does prevent, say, the most qualified students from going to schools like Harvard or any of the other elite colleges, then is it of any kind, maybe this is a very libertarian thing to say, is it of any comfort to you that perhaps just naturally just by the market forces, then say, because you know, Harvard, the quality maybe of the student body will go down because they're not picking the most qualified applicants, then eventually then the market will sort of rearrange itself, where students are realizing some of these top elite colleges are becoming a bit overrated because they're, you know, not meeting the quality that was expected, and they start to go elsewhere to colleges that don't do this sort of affirmative action or don't do it to the same extent. Is that of any comfort to you at all?
Sure.
It's a little comfort to me.
Kenny, just one more question. Oh,
What's
the
up?
question is actually from me. I had two questions for both Kenny and especially Peter. Peter, you mentioned the mismatch. You mentioned the mismatch hypothesis. So one of the implications is that if you didn't have affirmative action, does it imply that maybe more African-American students will be majoring in like science and engineering in the STEM field because they'll be going to colleges that are better ranked? That's my question number one. And question number two is that, do you think you'd be doing this kind of research and activities if you were not tenured? And so what kind of advice would you give, you know, to give us like non-tenure scholars? Is this something that we can do, or do you think maybe it's something that we should not do? Maybe it's too risky. Okay, right. So, okay. So Peter, you want to tackle that? And then Kenny, you have the last word.
Yeah, so on the second question, I've been doing this for a while. I started doing it when I was an assistant professor. The climate's changed a bit, so I think it's more difficult. But I think as long as you can approach it from a spirit of, I'm interested in the truth, but present it in a way where I think it matters how you present the material, for sure. And it really sort of relates to what Denise was talking about. So on the second question, I think there may be, if you're thinking about maximizing the number of Black engineers, for example, there may be an optimal amount of affirmative action. I think that there's a set of colleges where it's better to go to a better college than some of the ones at the very bottom. Where I think that becomes not true is if you go too far with that.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting, like if you look at the share of doctors that get produced, Black doctors that get produced by historically Black colleges and universities is pretty high. And I think that holds true also for the doctoral students. And that relates directly to some of the issues that we're talking about. I think there are other ways you can get there too, by just having a recognition, letting people know ahead of time. In my field of economics, for people who are thinking about going on to grad school, they have a summer program designed to help people prepare for that program. What I don't like, I think you could go a long way to solving some of those other issues about science mismatch if we were honest with our students about what was happening and provided them resources to so that they would come in a better situation.
Okay, thank you, Peter. I do hope you make chairman someday. You're right. So I don't know if there was I don't know if there was a joking or if you. So let's see what happens. Okay, Kenny, you have the last word.
Last word is by my book, Inconvenient Minority: The Attack on Asian American Excellence and Fight for Meritocracy. You're going to get all of these arguments and more, all based in facts, all based in data, some with experience, but always based in the data. Look, we've had a great discussion tonight. We talked about a lot of things. We hit on a lot of features. We hit on college outcomes, equity. We talked about people's stories. This is what it boils. This is how it boils down to me. Everybody has a personal story. Everybody does. Everybody has experienced things. Some have experienced worse things than others. There's no doubt. Absolutely not. But ultimately, would you like to be treated on something you cannot control about yourself? Or would you not? I would like to be treated on what I can control about myself. And what I can control about myself is my hard work, my study habits, my ability to perform, my friendships, my relationships, my character. That's what I can control about myself. I can't control myself. I can't control the fact that I was born this way, that I look like this, that any of you guys look like this. And so what is a fair society to me is a society where people are treated based on what they can control. I mean, as much as you can, you know, as that people have an incentive to go and to be the best that they can be, rather than I am X race, so I deserve this just by virtue of I am X race. That's not just to teach young people. That's not something I want to teach a high schooler. You know, I want to teach a high schooler through the college admissions process that hard work does win out, and they don't have to see that, you know, their friend whose daddy donated a lot of money to the university, or their friend who is of a different skin color gets in, but they don't, because, you know, of those features, at least on a large scale. If we want to have a country where people are trying to be the best that they can be, we need to start that at an early age. And that means our college admissions process has to model that. And so that's what I'm about. I'm about preserving this principle, meritocracy, inconvenient minority. That's my book. Go buy it.
Okay, thank you. I think we may not agree on affirmative action, but I think we can all agree this was a great discussion, a great debate. Thank you for everybody, for all the participants. Thank you very much. Great. Okay.
Thank you.
Right. So I know you guys are.
And if you guys want to have any other questions, just email me at my Colorado United email, kxu@coloradunited.org. I just put it in.
Okay, great. Just put
Follow
that
me
in
on
the Zoom
Twitter.
chat, and then I'm gonna leave the Zoom chat on. I'm gonna leave the Zoom on for the next 5 minutes. If you guys want to just chat informally, but my students, you guys have to go to team meeting now. Okay, all right. And then, so thank you very much. Okay, now the formal session's over. Now it's in.